continue with our examination of the letter that Rabbi Saul, Paul the Apostle, wrote to the Roman believers in the first century. It's a very important letter, as I shared with you before, that the early leaders in the Messianic community, which at that time was mostly Jewish, decided that these letters needed to be included in some book of some sort, some collection of important religious documents. And Paul, being a very important man in the early Messianic world, his letters, of which there are many, were considered a high priority to include. Romans is considered actually his theological masterpiece. His theological masterpiece. I call this chapter of Romans 11, God, Israel, and the Nations. The prophets of Israel understood that God married his chosen people, the Jews. Many are the statements found in the Torah and the Tanakh about how much God loved the Jewish people and was committed to them. Yet, there were times when Israel acted foolishly and actually broke the covenant that God had made with them. Hosea, one of Israel's prophets, described Israel as an adulterous wife, much like his own wife. Yet Hosea remained faithful to his wife and stuck with her even though she had broken her vows. In the same way, God has stuck with Israel over the centuries, even when our people had clearly broken their vows and cheated on him with false gods, fallible theology, and failed behavior. One has to wonder how God could remain faithful to a people that were sometimes faithless. I think all humans, with the exception of Yeshua in his humanity, would have cried out, "Enough already! Enough! I'm going to find another wife." It would have made some sense from an earthly perspective. And there were times that when Scripture tells us that's precisely what God felt and God thought. Yet, he never cast away his chosen people, and because of that, any follower of the Messiah can be assured that he or she would never be cast away from the Almighty God once they've chosen to follow him, once they become believers. Romans 11 explains all of this and the role Gentiles have in the salvation of God's chosen people. The first few verses I call God preserves a remnant in Israel. I'm going to read the scripture to you and comment on it as I go. In that case, what case? Well, you have to refer back to the last chapter in Romans 10:20, where Paul concludes by saying, Yeshayahu, Isaiah, boldly says, "I was found by those who were not looking for me. I became known to those who were not asking for me. But to Israel," he says, "all day long I held out my hands to a people who kept disobeying and contradicting." Isaiah was totally not politically correct. He castigated his people seriously for them not being faithful to God. All the prophets did that. That's part of the calling of a prophet, to call people to get back to following God vis-a-vis the Torah. In that case, I say, isn't it that God has repudiated his people, rejected his people? God forbid, heaven forbid. Paul asks rhetorically, did God reject his people, repudiate them? God forbid, he says, for I myself am a son of Israel. from the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not repudiated, rejected his people, whom he chose in advance. Or don't you know what the Tanakh says about Elijah? He pleads with God against Israel, and he says these words, Adonai, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I am the only one that's left, and now they want to kill me too. Elijah was desperately depressed. Desperately depressed. He had let God down when he led in the destruction of the idols of Baal, the worship of Baal in Israel. He had pretty much wiped it out, destroyed their prophets, had a great victory, bumped into Jezebel the queen, and she went, aha, Elijah, I'm going to get you. Now this is the great prophet who had just brought down fire from heaven through his prayer, and he runs into the wilderness afraid of this woman, Jezebel. He was very depressed. He had had a high experience, and then he came crashing down. It happens to people all the time. Nowadays they call it manic depressive and other things like that. Anyway, he was suicidal, and he felt that God was now abandoning him, that he had to stand all by himself in all of Israel, the only one who was righteous, the only one who would be fighting on behalf of God. That's what he said. Do you ever feel like you're the only one doing something?
Yes.
Could somebody give me some water? I think it's a common feeling. Those people who are the most zealous do what they have to do what they're responsible to do, and then do even more, and they look around occasionally and say, where's everybody else? Like Rhonda is in the kitchen right now, trying to get things ready. Maybe there's a couple people with her. We need help during ONED. We need everybody to pitch in. Rhonda's job is not to be a servant to all of us. She's one of the many people who are called to lead our congregation. Thank you very much, Sonia. Through service, yeah, that's fine. And I imagine there are times that Rhonda thinks, hey, I'm doing this all by myself. There's Rhonda. She's got a great attitude, so maybe she doesn't think this at all. But I would imagine that most people doing what she does, seeing that there's not a ton of cooperation, would say, hey, where's everybody else? You ever feel like that?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's a common feeling we all have. God says to Elijah, hey, buddy, there's 7,000 other people like you walking around here. Don't have a pity party. God's answer to him in verse 4, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not knelt to Baal. 7,000 who are standing for me is what he's telling Elijah. He wanted to encourage the guy. Elijah was really suicidal. He asked God to take his life away because he blew it so badly. Verse 5, it's the same way in the present age, there is a remnant chosen by grace. So, God answers Elijah, and Paul says that even in his day, there was a remnant of Jewish people that believed. And listen, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, right? His calling in life was to go to what I call Gentile land and talk to the Gentiles about the God of Israel. And he did it. He did it. He was faithful. All the while, Paul's saying, where are my people? Where are my people? Where are the Jewish people whom I am part of, whom I came to serve? Paul says it's the same way in the present age, in his era, there is a remnant chosen by grace. He knew it, he believed it, and he was going to see it soon. A remnant. You know, since the first century, friends, There has been a remnant of Jewish people who have trusted Yeshua. Did you know that?
Yes.
Since the days of the Messiah, there's been a remnant of Jews down through the ages that have been believers. We learned a few months ago that Paul begins the book of Romans with these words, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel," the good news, "because it's the power of God unto salvation to all who believe, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile." That's Romans 1:16. Paul sees this, the calling that he has for the Gentiles has to start with the ministry to the Jews. And indeed, this is what happened in his ministry. If you look at some time in the future at the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, verse 8, you read these words, "But you will receive power when the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, comes upon you, and you will be witnesses both in Jerusalem, Yehudah, Judah, Shomron, Samaria, and the ends of the earth." God told the believers in the book of Acts that they would spread the message to the end of the earth, but they would start in Jerusalem. And this is what happened. Many Jewish people became believers in the first century. And every place Paul went, by the way, where did he go first when he went to a new town? He always went to the synagogue first. He was the apostle to the Gentiles, but he always went to the synagogue first because he believed there was a remnant. And he was going to find that remnant. That 7,000 that had not bowed the knee to Baal, God says to Elijah, and Paul knew there was a remnant even in his day. According to my friends, Doctors John and Patrice Fisher, in their book, The Distortion, which I had the privilege of publishing, there were 1 million Jewish Yeshua followers in the first century. 1 million in the first century. Not all the Jews at that time, but I think you could admit that 1 million Jews at any time is a pretty large remnant. As the New Testament writers were all Jewish too, by the way, if you didn't know that. They were all Jews. I know for some of you, you think they were all Catholics, right? Some of you from that background. No, they were all Jews. Like Jerry Seinfeld. Not like him exactly, but you know what I'm saying.
How about Luke?
Luke was Jewish too. I'll talk to you another time about that, okay? He was a doctor, right? Okay. That's a joke. Anyway, and Yeshua never went outside of Israel. He said, "I've come only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Yes, there was a remnant of Messianic Jews in the first century. What happened in the following centuries is for another talk, for another day. It's all explained in a book I published by my friends Dr. Jeffrey Seif called "To the Ends of the Earth." It explains what happened at the end of the first century into the second and third century, and it's worth reading. Because you wonder, where'd the Jews go, right?
Yeah.
You read about Jews in the New Testament, but where'd they go? Dr. Seif explains it. There was a remnant, and clearly, friends, there's a remnant today. In the last 50 years or so, not only have again 1 million Jews become followers of Yeshua. Now you might say, well, where are they? I would say most of them are in churches. Most of them are in churches because a lot of them have been taught that being Jewish doesn't matter. Keeping the Torah doesn't matter. It's another discussion for another day. And so they say, well, we'll just go to nice churches because they have better programs. Their buildings are often nicer. And they sometimes assimilate and lose their identity, which I think is a shanda, a shame. But they're there. There's 1 million Jewish believers in this day. There's a remnant. The remnant has produced a number of new Bibles. The Complete Jewish Bible that I published. There's the Tree of Life version, another friend of mine published, and there's others as well. There's a remnant in this day. There are several new Bible schools and seminaries for Messianic Jews and Gentiles who want to learn about this stuff. We've come a long way. And there's some prestigious Messianic Jews in the public. You know, Donald Trump's lawyer, Jay Sekulow, he's a Messianic Jew. You see, there is a remnant even to this very, very, very day. And there's hundreds of Messianic congregations and groups in this country, maybe even thousands. And in Israel, there's several hundred Messianic congregations. A lot of them are Russian, formerly Russian, people from Russia, so former Soviet Union. You see, the remnant that Paul speaks about is real to this day. God has preserved a remnant in our time, but how has this happened? How has this happened? Verse 6. Now if it is by grace, he said the believers came not by what they did, but because of God's grace. If it's not grace, it's not according to legalistic works. If it were that, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. What follows is that Israel has not attained the goal for which she is striving. The ones chosen have obtained it, but the rest have been made stone-like. Just as the Tanakh says, the Tanakh is the abbreviation for the Old Testament, God has given them a spirit of dullness eyes, that they do not see, and ears that do not hear, right down to the present day. And David says, King David wrote, let their dining table become for them a snare and a trap and a pitfall and a punishment. Let their eyes be darkened so that they can't see with their backs bent continually. These are the prophets of Israel. Even King David admitted that most of the people had turned away from God, but they believed there was a remnant. They will believe that there were some that did believe. And that's what Paul is saying. Here he's expressing his great frustration with many of his people that had not accepted God's grace. So he quotes from Psalm 69, 23 to 24. I think Paul did this to show that this problem of some people rejecting God's grace was nothing new for the people in his day. It was something that happened in older days, and it's happening still to this day. How often we reach out to our people, the Jewish people, and we find ourselves getting rebuffed, sometimes spat upon. I'll tell you about that another day. We get called Meshudim or Meshubit. Meshudim means traitor. Sometimes even discriminated against in John's and other ways. There was a period of my life in the early days when I became a believer, zealously wanted to share the gospel with my people, where I worked with a group that went to New York City to hand out gospel tracts to let people know that the Messiah had come. Yes, I got spat upon, I got hit, I got called Meshubit, traitor. I'm not saying that in any boastful way. It's what happened in the early days of the Messianic world. There was a lot of rejection, a lot of persecution. It's not so much like that anymore, thankfully. Paul understood that, but he explains how this is squarely in the plan of God. This is in God's plan. God's purpose in rejecting Israel is what he addresses now in verse 11. In that case, I say, isn't it that they have stumbled with the result that they have permanently fallen away? That's a rhetorical question. Listen again. Is Paul saying, isn't it that they stumbled so that they have permanently fallen away? God forbid. No way, Paul says. Me benito. Quite the contrary. It is by means of their stumbling that the deliverance has come to the goyim, to the Gentiles, in order to provoke them to jealousy. The Jews stumbled, Gentiles got saved, and they were to provoke the Jews to jealousy. He continues. When I was in the United States Coast Guard Reserve back in the Vietnam era, there was a fellow in my Coast Guard Reserve unit named Lauren. He was a Swedish guy, I believe. He was probably 6'3", blonde hair, looked like a German, Swedish, very Aryan-looking guy, not Jewish-looking at all. I was practicing transcendental meditation at the time, thinking I'm going to find peace in my life. I was very troubled. It was the 60s. My parents had just got divorced. the Vietnam War was raging. Blacks and whites were about to kill each other. And I said, something is wrong in this world. I was always burdened by that. So I would go to my Coast Guard Reserve weekend meetings. And the first thing we had to do was to swab the deck. Swab the deck, everybody knows, mop the floor. Except that the regular Coast Guardsmen had done that on a Friday afternoon before they left. Yet we had to do it again. I thought, this is busy work, it's crazy, I don't want to do it. And I mumbled, and I grumbled, and I moaned, and groaned. And Lauren whistled and sang all the time. Drove me crazy. I went up to her one day and said, hey Lauren, what is it about you that makes you so blankety-blank happy? I was in the Coast Guard, I used what's called salty language. Fill in the blanks. What makes you so happy? Lauren looked at me and said, well, your Messiah lives in my heart.
Wow.
What a strange thing for me to hear. So I said, what's my Messiah doing in your heart? And by the way, who is my Messiah? Lauren explained my Messiah was Yeshua. I had been provoked to jealousy by Lauren's life, by his love, and now his language. Verse 12. Moreover, if their stumbling is bringing riches to the world, that is, if Israel is being placed temporarily in a condition less favored than that of the Gentiles, is bringing riches to the latter, how much greater riches will Israel in its fullness bring then? Paul sees that in the situation where his own people rejected their own Messiah, God had something else up his symbolic sleeve. As the famous philosopher and catcher for the World champion New York Yankees in the 50s and 60s said, you know the guy, Yogi Berra, famous philosopher. Has anybody ever heard of Yogi Berra? He wasn't a philosopher at all. He was an athlete, great catcher for the Yankees, and he had all these very interesting quips. His quip was, it ain't over till it's over. We could say that applies to this situation as well. The Jews have only stumbled and have not fallen away completely. It's a temporary situation, as we shall see, and we shall see there is reason for this Gentile salvations. If you're not Jewish but you're saved, the fact that Israel stumbled is the reason the gospel came to you. Just imagine how this struck the Gentiles in Rome when they heard this. And aha, they said. We've always wondered where the Jews in the pews were. Now we understand. Something that's been said down through the ages. Now we know the answer was to give Gentiles a shot for salvation. These are Paul's teaching about this. Sure, God could have reached the Jews in another way, but he chose the Jewish people to be the proclaimers of truth, and they had to stumble for a time so that he could connect with the non-Jews. God had to let the Jews be out of the limelight for a time so he could turn his attention to the Gentiles. That's exactly what happened. And Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, was the one called to do that, even though his heart's burden was for his Jewish people. Verse 13, however, to those of you who are Gentiles, I know many of you are, I say this, since I myself am an emissary to the Gentiles, I make known the importance of my work in the hope that somehow I may provoke some of my own people to jealousy and save some of them. For if they're casting Yeshua aside means reconciliation for the world, what will their acceptance be? Accepting him mean it will be life from the dead. Even though Paul's job description was to be a shaliach, a missionary, an apostle to the Gentiles, to the nations, he sees this as God's way to provoke his own people to jealousy so some of them might get saved. And that's going to be great news, not good news. It's going to be great news. In fact, it will be like the resurrection of the dead, says Paul, life from the dead. And he offers a word of caution, though, to the Gentiles that he's writing to. Now if the challah, or the bread offered as first fruits, is holy, so is the whole loaf. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches, he's talking about Jewish branches here, are broken off, and you, a wild olive branch, were grafted in among them and have become equal sharers in the rich fruit of the olive tree, then don't boast as if you were better than those broken off branches. Gentiles were grafted in through God's grace. And he was afraid some of them might say, well, the Jews were broken off and burned in the fire. And we've been grafted in, so we're better. Paul catches that right at the beginning. He says, don't boast like that. You're wrong. Branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in, they would say. And he says, true, but so what, Paul says? They were broken off because of their lack of trust. However, you keep your place only because you do trust. Don't be arrogant. On the contrary, be terrified. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he certainly won't spare you, Gentiles. History offers many examples of Christians who look down their nose at the Jewish people because they did not believe in Yeshua. I can make many long lists, but replacement theology, which was picked up by the Catholics, the Lutherans, and the Presbyterians, and you still see it to this day, replacement theology teaches that God replaced the Jews as the chosen people by the church. Did you know that?
Yes.
And they figure the Jews are probably irrelevant or maybe even worthless. This led to some pretty terrible things in history. We saw the movie Two Faces of Luther about a year ago, which showed this German theologian's attitude towards the Jewish people who did not accept the Messiah. His hatred toward them was virulent and violent. In fact, Luther's rantings in his writings were read by another famous German named Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler said, I get that the Jews have been set aside, replaced. We might as well get them out of the way. And that what led to the Holocaust. But you see, God had a good purpose in allowing the temporary blindness to happen to the Jewish people. He wanted the Commonwealth of Israel, as I referenced in Ephesians, the Commonwealth of Israel, which is made up of mostly Jews, but all certain Gentiles as well. He wanted the Commonwealth of Israel to include non-Jews to strengthen it. He wanted the Commonwealth of Israel to include non-Jewish believers to strengthen it. He wanted Gentiles to be involved. You know, when a farmer does some grafting, he takes a solid, naturally healthy root, and he surgically connects a wild root to the natural root, or wild branches to the natural root. This provides a slightly different flavor to the fruit, whether it's figs, wheat, or olives in this case, because he's talking about the olive tree. The natural plant grows, but somewhat differently. God wanted to bring some wild olive plants into the natural tree. God wanted Gentiles involved in the Messianic movement, is what I'm saying. You all who are not Jewish have a very important role to play in the Messianic movement. Verse 22. So take a good look at God's kindness and his severity. On the one hand, severity toward those who fell off, but on you, the other hand, God's kindness towards you, Gentiles, provided that you maintain yourself in that kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. So Paul's cautioning his Gentile friends in Rome to not blow it, to be kind towards the chosen people. It's an important point to remember because the wild olive branch, for it to flourish, the wild olive branch is grafted in. For it to flourish, what does it have to do? It has to stay connected to the root. If it gets disconnected from the root, it loses all its nourishment. This was God's way. God's Torah is the root. The Jewish people were the manifestation of that root, and Gentiles have been grafted into that and need to be stay grafted in. Sadly, the church cut off its Jewish roots in the early days of the Messianic movement, largely when the church decided that it was the new chosen people and cut off itself from the good food, the good nourishment that would come if it had stayed grafted in. If If you go back to the 300s, the Nicene Council for one, 315 or 325, the Catholic Church said, we're the new Israel. Those Jews, forget about it. They lost, they blew it, they lost it, they're lost. We, the church, are the new Israel. There's many references to that expression in the New Testament, but it's been misunderstood by the church over the years. The church made a horrible mistake. The church cut off its Jewish roots. Verse 24, he says, for you, Gentiles, were cut out of what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree. That's, he means the Jewish people. In those days, the Jews were the cultivated people. They had the Torah. They knew the ways of God. The Gentiles were wild. I can't even go into all those crazy things that the Roman people and the Greeks before them did that were so ungodly. But the Jews, although they didn't know Yeshua, lived a godly life. They behaved better. For you were cut out of what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree. How much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? Makes sense, doesn't it? It will be natural to graft back the natural branches, the Jewish branches. Although the wild branches can remain comfortably part of this olive tree of God. They can never be part of the initial tree because history won't let that. And they should remember not to take over the tree, but to allow the Jewish branches to flourish. But the Gentiles are part of the tree. By the way, it doesn't mean that God loves Jews more than Gentiles. I have to clarify that. He loves all people equally. He just loves Jews a little more equally. Verse 25, for brothers, I want you to understand this truth which God formerly concealed, but now it's revealed. So that you won't imagine you know more than you actually do. It is that stoniness, to a degree, has come upon Israel until the Gentile world enters its fullness. What is he saying? Paul reminds his people that God allowed the Jews to turn away, just as Isaiah said, it was to provide salvation for the Gentiles. This happened in a big way over the past 2,000 years. Wouldn't you agree? Look at the body of Messiah over the last 2,000 years. Very few Jews, just a remnant. Just a remnant, mostly non-Jews. Now it seems to me, though, that God is beginning to use the remnant of Jews once again. At the outset of this age, 12 Jewish men named the apostles, called the apostles, or shlichim in Hebrew. The shlichim, 12 Jewish men, zealously went out all over the known world. And what did they do? They preached the whole gospel, including the Torah, to the Gentiles in India. Some people think in China. All over the world, they traveled to spread the message. Jewish Messianic Jews. And in the book of the Revelation, the last book of the Bible, it tells us at the end of the days, 144,000 Jews will be called into action. 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel will be called into action. What a day that will be. 144,000 righteously zealous Jews like the Apostle Paul, spreading the message of the kingdom of God and the King, Yeshua HaMashiach. This message sets up the conclusion of Paul's letter, God's promise to restore Israel, verse 26, and that in this way all Israel will be saved. As the Tanakh says, out of Zion will come the Redeemer. He will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. With respect to the good news, they are hated for your sake, the Jews in Paul's day and the Jews today. Many Christians hate Jews today. It's changing, but many do. Look at the Catholics in Germany, what they did to the Jews. That was not long ago. With respect to the good news, they are hated for your sake, but with respect to being chosen, their love for the patriarch's sakes, for God's free gifts and his calling are irrevocable. His summary shows that Gentiles are a critical part of God's plan to Israel's salvation. When God takes away all the sins of his people, yes, they were rejected so the Gentiles could get in on this, but they are still beloved no matter what replacement theology teaches, no matter what Pastor Andy Stanley teaches about Christians not having to do anything more with the Torah, no matter what sort of anti-Semitism may erupt in the world and even in the church. No, they are beloved because of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promise that God made to them. God is faithful. He's going to keep his promise. Not only that, but these readers that Paul's writing to had to understand that God never unchose his chosen people. And to this day, that is still the case. Verse 30, just as you yourselves were disobedient to God before, but have received mercy now because of Israel's disobedience, the Jews being broken off branches, Gentiles being grafted in, so also Israel has been disobedient now, so that by your showing them the same mercy that God has shown you, they too may receive God's mercy. For God has shut up all mankind together in disobedience in order that he might show mercy to all. He is imploring his readers to show mercy and love towards his own people, the Jews. You can hear it in his words. And he's actually asking everybody, including us, to partner with him in this heartfelt burden to reach his own people, Israel. He closes Romans 11 with this sort of a doxology, and I think this is amazing. This is his summary. Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and knowledge of God. How inscrutable are his judgments. How unsearchable are his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Who has been his counselor? Or who has given him anything and made him pay it back? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. What a conclusion to Romans 11. The apostle to the nations has clearly explained what happened to the Jewish people in terms of salvation, how that has impacted Gentiles for many, many centuries, and what these Gentiles need to do to further the plan of God, and that is to reach Jewish people with your love and your witness and the message of the Messiah. So as a Messianic Jewish and Gentile congregation, let us receive the words of Rabbi Shaul and let them have impact upon our lives. Let us remember that God chose the Jewish people and it has not changed his mind. And let us recommit to do the work that God has called our congregation to do, to reach Jewish people with the message of the Messiah and teach Christians about the Jewish roots of their own faith. Will you join Rabbi Shaul, Paul? Will you join me and make a little bit more of a commitment to do what we can to remember to reach our own people, Israel? This is a very high and holy goal. It's a calling on our lives as congregants of this congregation. I want you to think about something as I close. Think about what it might mean in the world today, with all the troubles that this world faces. People not getting along with one another, immorality rampant, anti-Semitism on the rise, racism increasing, Arabs still threatening to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, Christians not having very much of a sense of the teachings of God because they have cut off their roots. Think about what it would mean if thousands of Jewish people became followers of the Messiah. We're a handful here. Most of us are not Jewish. Think about what it would mean if this was a congregation of 500 zealous Jewish people. A large remnant that could go out congregation and spread the message of the Messiah, not just to the Jews, but to the Gentiles as well. Just think about what that might mean. Now let me ask you, will you do what you can to help make that happen? Will you?
Yes.
Will you do what you can to help make that happen? It's on us. Who else is going to do it? It's on us. Will you do whatever you can to help make that happen? I know your answer is yes. Please stand as we close our service with the lady. I want you to listen again to